is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Pay heed all who enter and beware this podcast. That's right, this is the paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, along with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. And if you missed our show from earlier this week talking Big 12 Media Days, you can check that out on the KCSN feed as we talked all things Big 12 Media Days earlier in the week, as that's really sort of the official kickoff of the season, I think. And now we're here today. Kevin, we are exactly 7 weeks away from the start of the season. If you're listening to this maybe this weekend, you're under 7 weeks, actually. So even better, right? And the future you is going to be thrilled with the fact that it will be less than 7 weeks if you're listening over the weekend. But we're recording this on a Thursday. KU's going to play. They're opening their season on a Thursday coming up. Exactly 7 weeks from today, KU will take on Lindenwood. So if that doesn't get you fired up, I don't know what will. I mean, come on.
Yeah, in order to do these, we wind up going to the schedule page on KU Athletics and going to last year's schedule. And on there's a timer, to the first game. And going to that and seeing the number being below 50, it fired me up. I don't know about you, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we've had the discussion, right? It's like 50 days or 49 days, whatever, that feels like a long time, but 7 weeks feels like not a long time. So it's all about your frame of perspective here.
Well, and once camp starts off, you talked about on the Big 12 issue, like Big 12 Media Day is it feels like the kickoff a little bit to, hey, the off season's almost over. Camp gets here, almost immediately after that. It feels like, from a time perspective, and the second you start camp, it feels like you're a nap away from the start of the season, pretty much. I mean, it hits really, really quickly. So these last 7 weeks are going to fly by, I think.
Yeah, and we'll get into start previewing more of the 2024 season as we continue our off-season series of looking back at the 2023 season, getting ready for 2024 with our Jayhawk Rewind series. Today, we have a very fun one of the bye week. That's right. We're going to spend the next 40 minutes breaking down KU's bye week. Oh, wait. What's that? I'm getting word from our corporate overlords. Never mind. We're going to skip the bye week, actually. We're going to skip the bye week, actually, and instead jump straight to the game after the bye week, which was a much more exciting game than the bye week. And that is none other than Kansas and Oklahoma. This was a huge game, right? KU hadn't beaten Oklahoma since 1999, I think it was, or 1998 maybe. It was the last time.
I thought it was 96, the first 96. Year of the Big 12. Yeah.
So if it was 96, in that case, that's before I was even born, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Which is a bit depressing. So
I was going to say that you can say that's depressing. For me, that's really depressing.
Probably depressing for a different reason.
I was in high school at the time. It was not. I have a little more age on me than you do. For those who are unaware or cannot see my hairline on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. So
yeah. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll get a great view of our beautiful faces here. But yeah, so KU's going to KU takes on Oklahoma, right? Coming off of a stinging loss against Oklahoma State. And we'll quickly kind of go through the bye week, though, here, as I think for a lot of people, Kevin, this game against Oklahoma was the game that fans had circled for, okay, Jalen Daniels, hopefully he can get back for this game, right? You're going to have a bye week. You're going to have some extra time. Hopefully Jalen Daniels can come back for this game specifically. And as the bye week rolled through, it kind of became clear that maybe that wasn't necessarily going to be the case, which I think at the time was certainly disappointing, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, Lance Leipold actually talked about it at Big 12 Media Day when he said basically he thought Jalen might be back for this. Jalen did get, I believe, some workouts in, some practice in the time leading up to it. He warmed up for the game, too, from what I remember. I do remember him standing in pads for this game. So it felt like, that was kind of the turnaround. Oh, he's got a back injury. Let him rest through the Oklahoma State game. You've got the bye week. It was just a really nice, sort of clean, hey, he can come back at this point. It'll give him time to shake off any rust over the bye week. Whatever. Back injuries, Nick, are nothing close to clean. And that wound up playing out. And this wound up being a pretty messy game, quite frankly. Not a messy result necessarily, but when you look at the fact that Jalen didn't play, I'm sure, we're going to talk about Jason Bean and sort of his up and down performance, and the way that he finished over the course of this episode. You had bad turnovers. You had a lightning delay in the middle of an Oklahoma drive, right? And so when you throw sort of all these things together, it was sort of this really weird cocktail that wound up, being one of the biggest wins in recent KU history, certainly.
Yeah, it was a messy game, both from the football perspective and just like literally it was a messy game from the weather perspective, because you had the rain and the lightning, as you mentioned as well. Yeah. And heading into it, right, I mean, if you're KU, this was the last time you're going to be facing Oklahoma as a member of the Big 12. You knew at that point they were headed to the SEC. And as you kind of outlined it, they hadn't beaten OU in nearly 30 years at this point. So a lot was on the line in this game. You think about the fact that KU was coming off that loss against Oklahoma State. How are they going to sort of, bounce back from that? They had the bye week maybe to kind of flush that from their system as well. You looked at Oklahoma. I believe the Texas game was the game after this one for Oklahoma, right? They were going to be playing Texas the following week.
No, Oklahoma had already beaten Texas.
Oh, that's right.
As a matter of fact, they played them the week that KU played UCF, because that week I went to OU Texas. For those of you who don't know, my wife is from Oklahoma. Her family, they grew up Oklahoma fans, which is kind of interesting because their sister wound up playing softball at Oklahoma State. But her dad had always wanted to go to Red River. And, I had been there, I think, 4 times covering it. And we were able to get some tickets and everything and take him. And so I had seen Oklahoma already and seen Oklahoma in person. It's kind of funny, Nick, coming out of there, Oklahoma beat Texas literally the week after Texas kind of handled KU, and KU, of course, having the Jason Bean surprise start in that game, and everything else. But I came out of that feeling like Texas was better than Oklahoma, but didn't win the game. But I also came out of it feeling, honestly, Nick, like Oklahoma might be a little bit more vulnerable than maybe what the record, the undefeated, all of those things would have suggested. And that played out on a really weird kind of Saturday in a game that kind of had everything, right?
Listen, things get weird on Saturdays in Lawrence. That's all.
1997, by the way, was
97.
previous, Kansas win over Oklahoma. So I was a year off. You were 2 years off. We'll throw it right in the middle there.
There you go. Well, depending on when in 97, I may have actually been born at that point. So
October 4th.
Nope, not yet.
Oh, man. We were that close. People.
Couple months off. But yeah, no, this was a crazy game. And again, I think going into it, with the expectations of whether or not Jalen Daniels was going to play, certainly impacted maybe how KU fans felt, and certainly how I felt going into it, right? But also on the other hand, it eventually you get to this weird point where it's like, do you maybe just consider rolling with the guy that's been starting, right? Like,
sure.
Rust factor or something like that. So, and Jason Bean, obviously, even though KU lost against Oklahoma State, Jason Bean had probably his best game of the season. Certainly, if you look at the stats, his best game of the season to that point. And you thought, okay, well, maybe he's got some confidence. Maybe he could be the guy to take down the Sooners. Yeah,
and you look at the confidence that Kansas came out and played with in this one, and so often in games where you look at it and there is a big upset like this, how you start is everything, right? Because if it's the sort of thing that, and don't get me wrong, Kansas has shown a lot of mental toughness the last 2 years in terms of being able to respond, but coming out and just punching Oklahoma in the mouth the way that Kansas was able to, that really laid the stage for, okay, not everything is necessarily going to go your way in this game, but you can play with these guys, and you may even be every bit as good as these guys, on this given Saturday. And Kansas started off pretty well, Nick.
Yeah, I'm very excited to get into this game. As you said, it kind of had everything, and we are certainly going to be diving into it and maybe looking as well to what it might say about Kansas in 2024 as well. Right after this break, first, we're going to tell you about our friends at Home Field Apparel. Be sure to check out homefieldapparel.com. They've got over 130 different colleges and universities. They've got, obviously, Kansas, well over 30 items for KU. And we have you hooked up here on the Payheed Podcast with code PAYHEED25. before 15% off your first order if you haven't ordered home field apparel. Listen, we talked about it. You got 7 weeks, folks. You're running out of time. Every week I'm coming on here saying, hey, get over there. Your time is running out. You better get your KU gear so you can be repping it, whether you're going to Social Mercy Park or you're going to Arrowhead Stadium later in the year. Be sure to head over to homefieldapparel.com. Once again, 15% off your first order with PayHeed24. If you're watching on YouTube, it's written across the top of our screen here. PayHeed24 is the code. So let's dive into this KU Oklahoma game from last year coming up next, right here on the PayHeed Podcast.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
This is the PayHeed Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer along with Kevin Flaherty. If you like what you're hearing, or if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to leave us a like, leave us a comment, give us your thoughts maybe on how you felt about this particular game between KU and Oklahoma as well, and also leave us a 5-star rating and review. It helps us get out a little bit more here and help support the Kansas City Sports Network as well. Okay, so let's dive into this game because you kind of teased us a little bit, Kevin, earlier with saying a lot of things happened in this game, and that's true. It was chaos pretty much from start to finish. And first off, I just want to mention the weather here because obviously that factors in. We'll talk about it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
We're talking, it was in the low 40s, rainy, dreary, cloudy, really not great weather. And I think on its face, you would say that maybe favored KU. That didn't really necessarily come to fruition, I would say. I don't know. I'll be curious as we kind of go through this game here, but let's start with this. So KU gets the ball first to begin this game. And they were able to move down the field pretty effectively early in the game with an opening drive. Jason Bean had a couple of nice plays. They converted a long third down, pass from Jason Bean to Daniel Highshaw. Eventually, they get down to the OU 27. It's 4th and 3, and Lance Leipold decides to go for it. And this is one of those situations where I'm kind of all for it, right? I mean, KU's kicking game had just struggled in their last game against Oklahoma State. You got a 4th and 3. You've got guys like Daniel Highshaw. You've got guys like Devin Neal. Why not go ahead and go for it here? You're underdogs against one of the top 6 teams in the country. They opt to go for it. It's a pass play from Jason Bean, and it's incomplete for Luke Grimm. And so you feel a bit frustrated at that point, right? You just had a really successful opening drive and nothing to show for it because of the fact that you got stopped on a 4th down. At that point, how are you feeling about the decision? And maybe were you feeling discouraged at all that early in the game because of the outcome?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the weather, and we're going to bring up the weather because it was a major part of this game. I think, when you look at the weather and where they were at, I think it was on the 27. It was one of those things where it was really no man's land, right? Like you can't kick the field goal, especially with where KU special teams had been to that point. It was an environment that didn't really facilitate throwing the ball super well. I think that was a major thing, and certainly not kicking the ball well. And so I wouldn't have felt great about, Kansas kicking a 44-yard field goal anyway, if it was right, sun shining,
70 degrees,
birds are out or whatever else. Remember, KU had trouble with extra points recently. And so that had been a major factor. And so I wouldn't have necessarily felt great about a 44-yard field goal if all things were great. They weren't all great. I 100% get the decision to go for it in that circumstance with it being 4th and 3. Could you run it? Maybe you'd probably rather, take a chance throwing it incomplete. But then it winds up working out in Kansas's favor anyway.
Yeah, the whole stadium is probably feeling a bit deflated at that point, right? Oh, you're standing out here, it's 38 degrees, it's 40 degrees, you're getting rained on. KU gets stopped on the 4th down to start the game. You're thinking, gosh, you had a great drive. You would have loved to have got up 7-0. I mean, wouldn't being up 7-0 be really cool? And then Melo Dotson said, yes, being up 7-0 would be very cool because he went out and took matters into his own hands on a 3rd down for Oklahoma. Quarterback Dylan Gabriel really just very late on an out route read, I think, on a shallow out route. Melo Dotson picks it off, 37 yards, goes back for the touchdown. And suddenly getting stopped on 4th down the previous, a minute ago didn't even matter because in the end, you're up 7-0 after the pick six.
Well, and we've talked about Mello Dotson and specifically his case to be first team All Big 12, and his case is built around plays like this, right? When Mello Dotson made big plays last year, they were huge plays, and making that pick, running it back for 6 in that circumstance, Gabriel kind of hesitated a little bit, right? Like it was an RPO or a play action. It was. I think they were looking for the slant first. The slant was pretty well covered. You can't make that throw on a short hitch like that, off hesitation, off whatever else. It wound up being really easy money, but you still have to make the play. And Dotson did. And all of a sudden, just like that, Kansas is up 7-0. And it's almost like KU scored on his first drive. And so, and maybe even better because of the type of play that it was, and Kansas has some early momentum.
Well, and like you said, the case for Mello Dotson to be on the first team all conference for 2024 is this would be Exhibit A, right?
Yep.
His opportunistic playmaking, his ability to go out and make plays like this. He's a very opportunistic player, and I think he and Lance Leipold talked about this even at Big 12 Media Days, is that he and Kobe Bryant, both of them really, they work off each other well, right?
Yep.
They have differing styles, but that really benefits them collectively as a unit when you have those two guys paired together. And Mello Dotson, listen, he's not necessarily somebody that loves the spotlight like Kobe Bryant does, but that doesn't make him any less of a talented player, any less deserving of being on the all conference team. So, plays like this against Oklahoma last season are exactly why he's ended up on the all-conference team in the preseason for 2024. And in this situation, it kickstarted, KU getting on the board here against Oklahoma up 7-0. And you mentioned it, the weather really did cause some problems. And for Oklahoma, they got the ball back down 7-0. They took a long drive that was almost entirely run plays. They had an 11-play drive where I think they attempted just 2 passes over the course of this drive. There was a pass interference call on a third down on that drive against Kobe Bryant that really helped Oklahoma. They get all the way down to the KU 20, and Kansas really stands up because Dylan Gabriel on consecutive plays tried to scramble, and KU would not let him get away. It was, I believe it was Jeremy Robinson on the third down play that was able to keep him in check, and then on 4th and 3.
I think Hayden Hatcher, actually, wasn't it? Hayden Hatcher.
Yeah, Hatcher and Robinson.
I know Gage Keys was in there, but I think Hatcher was the end on that play.
Yeah. So they were able to contain him on the third down. And then on the fourth down, it's Austin Booker who stops Dylan Gabriel. And KU gives Oklahoma a taste of their own medicine, stopping them on fourth down, around the 20-yard line. And again, a situation where maybe if the weather wasn't a factor, Oklahoma may have just kicked the field goal there from the KU 20. Instead, they go for it. They get stopped. And Kansas is up 7-0, plus getting the ball back with the fourth down stop. And Kansas does their thing, man. They go on a long 10-play, 80-yard drive that takes almost 6 minutes off the clock. Jason Bean was able to make a couple of passes. There was a long pass he had to Lawrence Arnold on a third down early in that drive for KU when they were up 7-0. Going into the second quarter, KU continues the drive, and eventually Daniel Highshaw scores. And again, I mean, we've talked about it, but I really want to kind of hammer home this point about Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw, right? Which is, a lot of teams are going to prepare for Devin Neal, right? He is the guy that is sort of the real X-Factor type player. He's the player you got to keep an eye on. He can really hit a home run. But Daniel Highshaw, you've mentioned it, Kevin, he could easily be an 1,000-yard rusher and be the top running back on a majority of teams in the country, right? And when you have to deal with both of those guys and their differing styles, I think it can really wear on a defense.
Sure.
And we kind of saw it in this game, right? I mean, Daniel Highshaw ends up having 2 rushing touchdowns in the game. We'll get to his other one later on. But he ends up having a big impact, and he scores his first touchdown here. And Oklahoma, all of a sudden, they're on the road. Listen, I don't want to sort of bemoan Oklahoma. Oklahoma's probably not super thrilled about the weather situation. So you're down. Sure. You're now down 14-0. It's the second quarter. You're on the road. You're in crap weather, and you're probably not feeling too great if you're the Sooners at this point, as Kansas has all the momentum. Oklahoma would manage to respond, though, with a long touchdown drive of their own, and they finally figured it out. And then again, I thought this was so interesting, and we'll talk about this, I think, throughout this game, but Oklahoma comes into this game with Dylan Gabriel, who at the time was a guy that people were considering for the Heisman, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's a very, very talented player, now transferred to Oregon for this upcoming 2024 season. But the weather really forced Oklahoma to totally abandon Dillon Gabriel, basically. They were very, very focused on the run game, and they kind of decided that they were going to line up and try to beat KU with the ground game. And it did work in some cases. This was another drive where it did work for them as they got down the field. Eventually, Dillon Gabriel runs for a touchdown. So at that point, it's 14-7. 14-7, KU is up, and we're early second quarter at this point. You're still feeling pretty good, even though Oklahoma did go down and drive. KU then goes 3 and out, right? And at that point, you're thinking, you've kind of given away the momentum here. Oklahoma, with their ground and pound style coming into this game, seems to be working. It's 14-7. Oklahoma gets the ball back. They are starting again to do more ground and pound, and then lightning strikes. Now, normally when you say lightning strikes, you're thinking, oh my gosh, big play. Like, wow, there was a huge play. Some guy ran for a long. No, I am saying literally lightning strikes, as in lightning came down from the heavens and stopped the game at this point. It was an hour-long weather delay. I actually happened to be at the game. I spent some time in the concourse. I had some friends with a tailgate. We went back out to the tailgate, and it was raining. At this point, it was also like kind of pouring rain, really. And listen, Kevin, I got to say something. I wear glasses, and so when it rains, it becomes very difficult for me to see. I think if you are listening to this and you're a fellow glass wearer, you understand what I mean. You get water on your glasses, and it becomes more difficult to see. So I personally was not having a very fun time at all. But it was an hour-long weather delay. Both teams went back to the locker rooms. They come back out, and interestingly enough, Oklahoma just pretty much picks up right where they left off. They continue to just keep running the ball. They had a couple of long runs on this drive. So the weather delay happens with about 7 minutes left in the second quarter, with KU still at 14-7. OU comes back out, and they go right back to what they were doing before the weather delay, which is basically HB dive. And Toey Walker was really, really giving KU some trouble. He had a long run on this drive, and he ends up scoring a touchdown. And Oklahoma all of a sudden ties it up, right? And this was interesting because on one case, you almost questioned whether Oklahoma was going to be able to respond in that fashion, right? I mean, I think, from the KU perspective, you're thinking, oh, how mentally tough is Oklahoma, right? How badly do they want this? They're an undefeated team, sure. They're on the verge of possibly making a push for the college football playoff at this point. But, you're playing in 40-degree weather. It's rainy. It's cold. KU's up 14-0. How badly do you want it? And Oklahoma, they kind of really showed their mettle at this point in tying this game.
Yeah, and I think even beyond that, whenever you have a long weather delay like that, there's always some question about who's going to respond to it. And I think when the lightning hit, KU fans are probably like, oh, good, Oklahoma, they just scored a touchdown. They're starting to go down the field again. They've got a lot of momentum, make them go sit down for an hour and really think about it. It didn't slow Oklahoma down. They wound up, coming back out, acting like there was no delay, going down and scoring. And like you said, I think Oklahoma, when you looked at that roster last year, they weren't Oklahoma from a talent standpoint necessarily, across the board and what you're used to seeing from Oklahoma. But I do think that one of the areas where Brent Venables is fantastic, and one of the reasons I think they do have a chance to succeed in the SEC as their talent continues to grow, is I think that program is going to be really mentally tough. I think that, when you looked at that Red River game, they had a goal line stand in that game against Texas's incredibly physical offensive line where they just bowed up and said no. And Texas took the lead late despite Oklahoma kind of outplaying Texas for most of that game, and Oklahoma went right down the field and threw the game-winning touchdown, late. And so it was a team that had some mental toughness to it and those responses. And I think that's important to view. I realize this is a KU podcast, but I think it's important to look at when viewing this game and looking at the game through this prism, because there were certain opportunities in here where either team could have folded or could have said, you know what, it's not our night or whatever else. And it wound up being one of those things that, literally was kind of decided by the clock, right? In terms of who was going to have the ball last and the mental toughness that both programs had. So, yeah, Oklahoma responds, ties it up, and then the worst thing possible happens for Kansas.
Yeah, the weather, unfortunately, reared its head again for KU. So at this point, Oklahoma's tied it, but you're thinking, okay, Kansas can get the ball back, get on a drive here to try to take the momentum back. Wrong. Instead, Trevor Wilson fumbles the ensuing kickoff. It was a shorter kickoff because of the rain, because of the weather, and Trevor Wilson's unable to handle it. Oklahoma recovers. They get the ball right back inside the red zone immediately after just scoring a touchdown, and they don't miss a beat. They score again, and within about 90 seconds of game time, Kansas goes from being up 7 to being down 7, as Oklahoma would then score again with another Dylan Gabriel touchdown. Another Dylan Gabriel touchdown. So now you're down 21-14, just like that, right? And you're thinking, oh gosh, this is brutal. And at this point, there is about 5 minutes left, a little under 5 minutes left in the first half, with KU down 21-14, and Oklahoma is going to get the ball back to start the second half as well. So at this point, you're thinking Kansas absolutely has to show some sort of response here. They have to get some sort of points before the end of the half. You can't allow Oklahoma to steal the lead away in the span of basically, a minute of game time, and then also get the ball back again to start the second half without responding in some way. And Kansas is able to manage to scrape together a long drive that sort of really kills two birds with one stone. They end up getting some points out of it with a field goal, and they also end up taking enough time to where Oklahoma can't really do anything to end the half. But Kansas, they move down the field, and unfortunately, Jason Bean missed Trevor Cardell on a goal-to-go situation, and then couldn't complete a pass to Mason Fairchild either as well. But this was also a drive that included one of the more spectacular catches from Quentin Skinner, also, in which he makes an insane juggling catch on the sideline at one point in this drive. So really some heroics by Quentin Skinner allowed Kansas to get the ball down the field in this drive, and they get goal to go from the 6-yard line but can't score and are forced to kick field goals. So I don't know, kind of mixed feelings about this, right? I mean, I've said on the show, you never want to see the old 12-play, 79-yard field goal drive, but also, given the circumstances, just getting anything, I think, is still a positive for KU at this point.
Yeah, Kansas had to stop the tide. It was Oklahoma had scored 21 straight. You were coming off making, a really big error on the kickoff. Kansas just needed a response. And while it would have been ideal to have a touchdown there, I also think, too, Nick, it's kind of interesting to see the way that the two approach the weather from a passing game standpoint, right? Like Dylan Gabriel was having a huge year. He winds up throwing the ball 19 times. And obviously he had, a few more dropbacks than that. He did get sacked a couple times, did have a couple scrambles, whatever else. But he threw the ball 19 times. KU put the ball in the air 32 times, was not nearly as accurate with it, but landed some absolute haymakers with the passing game. And I think, the play to Quentin Skinner obviously was not one of Jason Bean's probably better passes, winds up being tipped. Skinner was out of bounds, comes back inbounds to make the catch. But at the same time, it was interesting to see sort of the way that wound up being approached a little bit. Oklahoma basically said, no, that's it for the most part. We're not throwing the ball. We're not putting the ball at risk. And that might not have even been the strategy heading into the game, but maybe after the interception and pick six to Mello Dotson, Oklahoma really turtle-headed it in. Whereas Kansas, put the ball in the air, took some risks, and as we're going to see, some of them, like the Quentin Skinner play and some big plays later on, worked out, and there were some that didn't. And it was kind of interesting to see the way that both teams approached that.
So Oklahoma ends up just taking it to the half, up 21-17. And again, if you're from the Kansas perspective, you're probably feeling a little bit mixed, right? I mean, you got stopped on fourth down, but you got a pick six, and you were up 14-0, but then you gave up that lead. Oklahoma took the lead back, but you kind of salvaged a little bit at the end of the half with the field goal. So maybe feeling a little bit mixed. And then in the second half, things just get even more weird as the second half progresses. It starts off with neither team really being able to score, early in the second half with OU punting a couple times. Kansas had a punt as well, as they really couldn't get their ground game going. So it's still 21-17 at this point. And Kansas gets the ball with about 7 minutes left in the third quarter after a bad punt by Oklahoma, by the way. Oklahoma had a shanked punt of about 30 yards that gave KU pretty good field position near midfield. And they were able to capitalize off that with a field goal. They got down, and a really, really deep pass from Jason Bean to Mason Fairchild to begin this drive helped kind of spur them into the red zone. And they eventually do get a field goal out of it to make it 21-20. So now you're only down one if you're Kansas. And Oklahoma then has a play when they get the ball back, and it's a fumble recovered by Kansas. A huge play in the game. There was a fumble early in the game, if you recall, Kevin, that got overturned by forward progress at one point earlier on. This one stands as a fumble for Oklahoma, with, again, the weather having an impact, as in the end, Kansas forces the fumble. It was J.B. Brown with the big hit that forced it and the recovery. And J.B. Brown is such an interesting player because these are the types of plays that he can make, right? He is a heat-seeking missile, I think, at times on the field. And I think KU will need more of that from J.B. Brown in 2024, right? Especially when you consider that he kind of steps in as sort of the main guy, right? I mean, you lose Rich Miller. Cornell Wheeler has obviously made some plays well last season and has played, but when you think of the Kansas linebackers in 2024, you think of J.B. Brown, and hopefully he can continue to expand his game, right, and be more effective overall as a linebacker for KU. But he is a guy that can make these type of immediate impact plays that can change the tide of a game. And I hope to see him do it more in 2024, and he did it here for KU in this game against Oklahoma.
Yeah, they really needed to upgrade their athleticism at linebacker in the offseason, and that was a big part of the reason that they pursued J.B. Brown in the transfer portal. And you know, you think of the biggest hits over the course of the season. If you leave off offense and so leave off Armaje Reed-Adams, you know, going into motion, you know, you think of the Kobe Bryant hit against BYU, obviously, that kind of changed that game quite a bit. This was one of the better hits of the year. I mean, J.B. Brown just absolutely squashed Jaleel Farouk, and it was, you know, a sort of a textbook tackle. Ball comes loose, KU gets it. I did think it was kind of interesting on the stat sheet. It said J.B. Brown recovered it. J.B. Brown was up and celebrating while the guys were still on the ground, you know, going for the football. So J.B. Brown did not, in fact, also recover the football. But no, it was a heck of a play. And I think one of the other things, Nick, I mean, I realized it was one play, but one of the things that kind of played out over the course of this game was Oklahoma was a pretty physical team, and Kansas matched Oklahoma's physicality. I thought up front, you know, Kansas's offensive line, you know, they ran for better than 5 yards a carry, and you know, the running backs were physical, you know, didn't usually go down on first contact. Defensively at times, even though Oklahoma wound up running for quite a few yards themselves, defensively at times, Kansas was also able to match that physicality. And you'll see that on a huge possession later. But in this case, you know, you get a really big turnover, something that, you know, you don't want to say necessarily was like the game-changing play, but in concert with the play that happened immediately after was kind of a game-changing sequence.
Yes. Then you get to really one of the more impressive athletic feats from just a speed standpoint, I think, that I've ever seen. And that was Jason. Do what?
The carry, right?
Yes. And that was Jason Bean. I mean, literally, when you watch it back, it almost doesn't even make sense how he scores. I mean, it looks like there's about 3 or 4 Oklahoma defenders that have the angle to get him. And Jason Bean, just like a track star in the Olympics, just blows by everybody down the sideline and scores a touchdown. As you said, it was really one of the most impressive plays. You know, it reminded me of his long run that he had against Oklahoma State in 2022 as well, where it seems like he's not going to get there. It seems like the other team is going to get to the edge, and instead, zoom, just straight past him for a touchdown.
Jason Bean had said for the previous 2 years that he was the fastest guy on the Kansas team. And on that carry, according to Real Analytics, he hit 22.4 miles per hour, which, if you don't know, is just absurdly fast. I mean, just ridiculously fast top speed.
I don't even know if I could pedal a bike 22 miles per hour.
It was the fastest carry by any quarterback in college football last year. And to put it into perspective, the fastest carry overall that Real Analytics tracked was actually Xavier Worthy, the Chiefs' first-round draft pick, at 22.7, Jason Bean at 22.4. So one of the fastest carries of the entire season at any position in all of college football. And so, Bean has always been fast. In high school, he was a sub-10 400-meter guy, ran in the 10.3s. That automatically makes you, if not the fastest guy on any football field, you're racing the guy for the fastest guy on the football field whenever you're on it. And just the way Bean runs differently, I feel like, when he's got open field in front of him. When there are other guys there, it maybe feels like there's a little bit of, him being tentative or whatever else. When he has a straight line and he can see sort of that track in front of him, he gets up on the balls of his feet. He really accelerates. And, like you said, it almost didn't make sense in that it felt like Oklahoma had the angle at multiple points, and they didn't come close. I mean, you hear about guys, he beat the angle. Jason Bean smashed the angle. He absolutely annihilated the angle. And like you said, it was almost one of those, your jaw just dropped, because it was just a tremendous display of straight line speed.
So at that point, it's 26-21. Kansas regains the lead, and they go for two and fail on the 2-point conversion.
Super fun play, though, right? In terms of, you had the linemen all on the left, lined up almost like wide receivers. You had the wide receivers in front of the quarterback, and they were able to kind of sneak Luke Grimm off. He was open. Again, wet conditions, not the best for throwing the ball. Luke Grimm's open in the end zone. Jason Bean, throws it too shy. Grimm can't quite, get under it or whatever else. It winds up being the first of many screwed up, 2-point conversions on this thing. And it's, but it was a really cool play design and something where KU probably should have converted in drier conditions, maybe would have converted, but instead 26-21.
26-21 at that point, and Oklahoma, to their credit, they respond back again with a touchdown of their own. They go down and again, a couple of long runs, but then they end up getting a long pass to Drake Stoops. And I believe was there a penalty on that play as well? I think that helped Oklahoma move the ball down the field also to Drake Stoops. It was a long pass to Drake Stoops for almost 40 yards from Dylan Gabriel that got them all the way down into the red zone. And from that point on, they were able to pound it into the end zone with a touchdown to make it 27-26. Oklahoma then goes for two to try to make it, at that point, a 3-point game, 29-26, but they fail. So now you have a 27-26 game late in the third quarter at this point, with KU getting the ball back.
Yeah, it's one of those just sort of back and forth, and you head into the fourth quarter, it being a 1-point game, and you being there, Nick, what was your thought at that point? It's 27-26, heading into the fourth quarter. It's literally anybody's game, but at the same time, you feel a lot better about an upset bid if you're up rather than being the team that's down by a point.
Yeah. I mean, it was a strange feeling. I've talked about, sort of the feelings that you have of KU of old, KU of the decade before, where you would never really imagine KU being in a situation like this. And the few games that they were, you almost anticipated that something would go wrong that would ensure that they do not win. And now KU at this point is 15 minutes away, a little over 15 minutes away from what would arguably be probably one of their greatest wins in program history, right there with the Texas win they had earlier on in the Leipold era. So, yeah, I don't know. I'll just say this. I'm glad that I was not having to play in the game for various reasons because of the weather, but also because, I was feeling very stressed, right? I was feeling very nervous about this because it felt like a win of this magnitude was within reach for Kansas, and it wasn't really that difficult to talk yourself into KU closing it out in the fourth quarter.
Well, different coach on the Oklahoma sideline, different quarterback, but Kansas had put itself into a similar situation, the last time Oklahoma had come to Lawrence, when you looked at, the sort of the controversial fourth down stop where Caleb Williams steals the ball.
Caleb Williams.
And Oklahoma ultimately winds up winning by a couple scores. And so you say, my gosh, they were right there. They had the chances to win, but the plays didn't come off. I don't want to say there was a worry at that point that it was going to be similar, but you still weren't necessarily like, okay, KU's winning this game. There's no doubt in my mind. There's a difference between hoping to win and knowing you're going to win. At this point, I think, if you're KU, you're still hoping to win. You're hoping the play or two comes off, but you also, KU fans have been burned a lot in those sorts of games, even when they had managed to play teams close like that. And it's interesting because I've seen interviews with Lance Leipold where people talk about that Texas game, right, as the game that kind of jump-started everything. And Leipold has actually looked at that Oklahoma game and said, we were on that track before the Texas game. The Texas game was big, and that the players were able to get rewarded for their hard work, right? They were able to tangibly see an outcome that was positive on their hard work, but they had been improving over the course of the year. They showed that in almost beating Oklahoma, 2 years before, and now Kansas more talented, more seasoned, and more experienced. They had won more close games. And they were approaching it probably in a little bit different mentality heading into that fourth quarter than what they did, against Oklahoma the previous time.
Yeah, and the question continued to be, and we mentioned it, in games past, is in a 1-point game with Jason Bean, can you win? Versus a 1-point game where Jalen Daniels was the quarterback, right? Like, can Jason Bean come through essentially in the fourth quarter? And at this point, KU's down 27-26. They get the ball right at the end of the third quarter, start of the fourth quarter, and kind of a crazy play where Kansas benefits big time from a play in which they got 30 yards of penalties on a play where I believe it was Luke Graham who was he tackled out of bounds, right, on the Oklahoma sideline, took a late hit out of bounds. Then there was another unsportsmanlike also on the Oklahoma bench at that point as well. That resulted in Kansas getting 33 yards on this play on a hit, and then the bench got called for unsportsmanlike conduct. And then really that continued later in the drive as somewhat of a, was it on this drive where
the Jason Bean slide.
Yeah. Yes.
One of those things that I think every fan base was mad about the result almost because, you're sitting in a 3rd and 3. Jason Bean is trying to run the ball for the end zone, and he slides short. And you said it's 3rd and 3. You're at the end zone. Lay out, make a play. Lower your shoulder, try to get into the end zone. It ultimately winds up working out for Kansas, though, in that Bean, gives himself up. He gets hit anyway. It was kind of a controversial play, I guess, if you will. Just it was something they called targeting. They review for targeting. They confirm the targeting. All of a sudden, you go from 4th and 1 because Jason Bean slid too early, rather than going for the goal line, to having a 1st and goal at the 1. Just a huge sequence of events there. One, like you said, if you're a Kansas fan, you're thinking, Jason, it's a 1-point game in the fourth quarter. You're at the goal line, make the play, but Kansas winds up getting bailed out a little bit.
Yeah, extend for the touchdown there. But as you said, it ended up working out. Daniel Highshaw ends up getting his second touchdown of the game at this point on a 1-yard touchdown run after the targeting play on the Jason Bean slot. So it's 32-27 after the touchdown. Kansas goes for 2 again, and womp womp, they don't get it again. So now you've got this really weird situation where both teams have tried to go for it now multiple times, and you've got a 32-27 game with Oklahoma getting the ball back. Except, psych, they didn't get the ball back because the same thing happened. The weather happens again. The weather strikes again, this time for Kansas. And almost a mirror image of Trevor Wilson muffing the kickoff earlier in the game. It happens to Oklahoma. And I don't know, Kevin, these are the types of plays where, as a KU fan, you almost just don't expect them to bounce KU's way.
Sure.
You know, when you think about some of the old KU football, but in this case, it did bounce their way. Kansas gets the recovery. The unfortunate part for KU, though, is that unlike Oklahoma, who was able to convert for a touchdown off the muff kickoff earlier in the game from Trevor Wilson, Kansas gets stopped. They there was a holding call that kind of backed them up to start the drive, which really kind of set them back a little bit after getting the ball in the red zone. And ultimately, they try to settle for a 42-yard field goal. Seth Keller misses. And at that point, you're still only up 5. And that felt like a real gut punch, a real missed opportunity. Yeah. You know, at the very least, if you kick a field goal, you make it an 8-point game at that point, to where Oklahoma will be forced to score and go for 2 to take the lead, or to tie it at that point. So you know they can't take the lead off of you. And if you score a touchdown, you're up 2 possessions late in the game. And instead, it felt like a big miss for Kansas that maybe would come back to bite them, still only being up 5.
Yeah, at best and worst of special teams over the course of like 4 plays, right? You know, and it was interesting. I mean, KU kind of sky kicked it, you know, and it was the up back that tried to get it and couldn't bring it in. But you watch the play over, and, you know, the reason Kansas gets that ball is, you know, they had great speed and effort on special teams on that play. I remember Mason Ellis was one of the guys that kind of got in there early. You know, there was a pile up for the ball. There were guys, you know, kind of blowing up the pile. Cornell Wheeler, I think, maybe came away with the ball. And then Daniel Highshaw runs for a touchdown on the very next play, called back, you know, for holding. KU gets behind the sticks. You missed the field goal. Like you said, it felt like such a huge missed opportunity. Not necessarily that, hey, if it's an 8, the game is put away. But at the same time, you have breathing room at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know they can't take the lead.
Possession, you know, and so to miss that was just absolutely huge. It was a 42-yarder. We talked earlier about KU going for it when it was a 44-yarder. I'm not saying that they should have gone for it. In this case, it was 4th and 14. But at the same time, you can see a little bit maybe why it was a wise decision earlier in the game to go for it when having a field goal in that range with those field conditions, you know, kind of everything else. But just a really big missed opportunity and a huge swing from turnover/touchdown to not getting any points out of it, and Oklahoma ultimately getting the ball right back. But, you know, Kansas's defense, as you know, we'll see on multiple occasions, you know, late. Kansas's defense also, I think Oklahoma would have had a chance, not necessarily to put it away, but really put Kansas behind the 8 ball there if they had responded immediately with a long touchdown drive. Instead, Kansas gets a stop.
Yeah, Kansas does get a stop off Oklahoma. It was interesting. Oklahoma there was about 8 minutes left in the game. Oklahoma's down 5 at this point. It's a 4th and 4 from right at midfield.
Yep.
And you almost wonder if Oklahoma maybe would have considered going for it. They end up punting and pushing Kansas back, and it ends up being a smart play because in the end, Kansas, Jason Bean makes the first of what ended up being a couple of mistakes late in the game for KU that really, really made you want to pull your hair out late in the game if you're Kansas, as with the interception, right?
Yeah.
Oklahoma gets an interception inside the red zone for Kansas with a 5-point deficit, and they turn right around and score immediately with a couple of runs. It ends up being Dylan Gabriel who punches it in for a touchdown. And again, right, if it's an 8-point game, Oklahoma would have had to go for 2 just to try to tie it. But instead, with it being a 5-point game, Oklahoma takes the lead with the touchdown, and shockingly, they try to go for 2, and shockingly, they don't get it. Nobody could convert a 2-point conversion in this game. So Oklahoma gets out in the 2-point conversion after the interception by Bean, and it's a 1-point game at this point, 33-32. You've got about 5 minutes left. You're thinking plenty of time for Kansas, right? This would be Exhibit A of where you would say, okay, in a 1-point game, you need a touchdown and you've got 5 minutes. Who do you trust to execute your 5-minute offense, right? This is where you would say, if you have Jalen Daniels, you're probably feeling great. Jason Bean, fresh off of his interception, the general sense was, I think, of extreme anxiety at this point.
Yeah, and then he starts off pretty well, right? In terms of, you get the first down to Devin Neal. You wind up facing a 4th and 4. He hits Luke Grimm for 10 yards. And then you wind up with a 3rd and 10. And Kansas decides, they call a screen to kind of one side on the play. Devin Neal is supposed to block Ethan down, or at least make it look like he's blocking Ethan Downs, and then kind of slip into space. Downs reads it to his credit and is sitting right there. Jason Bean decides to make the throw anyway. It's picked off. At this point, Kansas has all 3 timeouts. You think, I don't want to say you think the game's over, but all 3 timeouts, Oklahoma's run the ball pretty well overall over the course of the game. And that, a first down probably pretty much ends this thing. And you're sitting there thinking the game may not be over, but it's on life support at this point. And then we talked about the physicality of Kansas's defense stepping up at times. And we've talked on this show about how one of the things that Kansas wanted in the offseason was to gain the ability to run the ball when the other team knew that KU wanted to run the ball. This was the exact opposite. Both teams knew that Oklahoma wanted to run the ball here. If Oklahoma gets a first down on 3 carries or whatever, and let's be frank, if Oklahoma had gotten it down to 4th and 1 or 4th and 2, probably would have gone for it. You would have had to stop them on 4 straight carries. 1 yard loss, faces a 3rd and 12. Oklahoma tries to run it again, and no, 5-yard gain, and Oklahoma is in a spot to punt. Kansas is getting the ball back. 2 minutes left. Has to go 20 yards, or is it? Yeah, 20 yards because it was a touchback, or they have to go 80 yards. Sorry, the ball was at the 20. You got to go 80 yards in 2 minutes, basically. You only need a field goal, so I guess you don't technically need to go 80 yards. But again, kicking game, a little bit shaky, and we'll get into that here in a minute again. But the kicking game had been shaky. You don't have timeouts. Jason Bean has thrown interceptions on back-to-back possessions. Nick, what are you thinking at this point?
Yeah, just to circle back to the second interception, right? That's the one that most people will remember because it was a play where if you are somebody who's ever played Madden or played some of the old NCAA football games, you know that there are certain situations where you can take advantage of the CPU in the sense of the CPU will do the same thing over and over again and it doesn't matter, right? One of those plays that you can do is when the CPU tries to run a screen pass, because the CPU will throw the ball to the running back no matter what, whether or not you have a guy there or not. And that was kind of what happened with that screen pass, right? It was sort of a, oh my God, what did you just do type moment, throwing it directly to Oklahoma at that point. And I was gonna preface, you talked about the next drive for Oklahoma. I was going to preface that by saying Oklahoma fans maybe want to plug their ears because it was pretty poorly mismanaged by Brent Venables in Oklahoma, just in terms of kind of how that played out. And eventually giving the ball back to Kansas and giving KU another chance with about 2 minutes left in the game, as you said. So you kind of painted the picture there, though. You've got no timeouts. You've got 2 minutes to work with basically, and you got to get down the field and make something happen. And Jason Bean settles in to begin the drive at least with a nice 13-yard run. Then they complete a pass to Mason Fairchild. They're trying to hustle. They're trying to move. They eventually get down, and possibly one of the best plays of the season, or one of the plays of the season for KU, on a 4th and 6 with the game on the line. Jason Bean finds Lawrence Arnold across the middle of the field, and he's able to break a tackle and run for almost 40 yards down inside the red zone to help set up Kansas. Really, a game-saving play, right? And a game-defining play, and tip of the hat to Lawrence Arnold. And again, we talked about these receivers. Some of the plays Quentin Skinner has made, Luke Grimm as well. And Lawrence Arnold saves the game here for KU. And on top of that, you think about looking ahead to 2024, he is the type of guy that can make these types of plays, right? Luke Grimm has an excellent connection with Jalen Daniels. Quentin Skinner can make X-factor plays. But I think I'm almost tempted to say, when you have a situation like this, Lawrence Arnold becomes your number one guy because of his catch radius, because of his ability to make big plays. And here, he certainly does it. And you hope to see him do more of that in 2024 also.
When he was coming through the recruiting process, I had multiple discussions with Barton Simmons, who's now the general manager of Vanderbilt, but at the time was the top rankings guy for 24/7, about Lawrence Arnold being a 4-star prospect. And ultimately, he didn't get that, but it was something where Barton was open to it. And a big part of it was a lot of the stuff that you just talked about, him being a pretty good athlete, for how big and how tall and how long he was. And the fact that when you play Oklahoma, when you play Texas, Lawrence Arnold looks like a wide receiver 1, right? Like he walks off the bus and he looks like what you want an outside receiver to look like. And so I'm 100% right there with you. I thought, too, one, it was a season-changing play for Jason Bean. It would, if you're just saying, hey, what was his best play of the game, you might bring up the run and say that was the best play. In terms of the play that carried over and the play that wound up meaning the most, I really think it was that 4th down play. And it was extremely well executed, everywhere by KU. Oklahoma, they send 3, they keep a 4th defender kind of in the box as a spy type guy on Jason Bean. Kansas's offensive line gave Jason Bean plenty of time to sit back there, the route to develop, everything else. Jason Bean, to his credit, for a guy who had thrown interceptions, who could have been a little bit gunshot, Jason Bean stepped in and absolutely ripped a laser on that play. And I really think when we start talking about where Jason Bean went from here, I still say the Iowa State game was darn near flawless, in terms of the way he played that game, and we'll get there. But I think it really started with this play, because we talked about the Oklahoma State game. Great game for Jason Bean, but the execution at the end wasn't necessarily there where you really needed it to be. In this game, some big moments, some big plays, throws 2 interceptions late where the execution at the end isn't there. Jason Bean needed to have something go right. And not that's too passive. He needed to make something go right in order to kind of come out on the other side of this thing. And I really felt like that was that play, Nick, with him cutting it loose, with Lawrence Arnold catching it. All of a sudden you're in a spot where, KU is within range of a touchdown. Oklahoma, I think, a little bit worried, and here's where we're going to talk the special teams thing a little bit. I think Oklahoma was worried that KU was going to run the clock down and kick a field goal. If I'm Oklahoma, with the conditions, with KU's kicking game, I bow up, right? And I say, you know what? Like, make the field goal. We dare you. Instead, Devin Neal scores a touchdown on the very next play to take the lead. I think if you watch the play back, there are certain Oklahoma players that don't necessarily look like they're exactly opposed to to Devin Neal finding the end zone. I do think I don't know if it was a conscious decision or not. It seems like it probably was to, hey, let Devin Neal score if it's there or whatever else. But if you're Oklahoma at that point, with the way KU has really struggled kicking the ball, with the conditions, with all of those things, am I crazy for thinking that you let the clock run down and you make KU make a pressure-packed kick in that situation rather than giving up the score?
No, I think you're right on that. I think I would have probably approached it the same way. And again, this is where I think Oklahoma fans would probably be very frustrated with this game, in the sense that it was pretty poorly managed, really, from like the 4-minute mark till the end by Brent Venables and by that Oklahoma sideline. And this is another example of that, right? But also on top of that, I think Oklahoma was really just shell-shocked from the previous play, right? I mean, Jason Bean single-handedly changed his perception from KU fans, single-handedly changed the narrative of his kind of career at Kansas, really, with that play. And also, it was a great play as well. So I think Oklahoma was maybe a bit shell-shocked as well off that, and that allowed Devin Neal to go and score. And at that point, you take the lead. You're up 38-33 at that point. Shockingly, I hate to bring it up again, the 2-point conversion fails. The 2-point conversion fails again. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but the 2-point conversion fails. So it's still a 5-point lead. There's about 45 seconds left in the game when Oklahoma gets the ball back. And their drive actually starts with a holding penalty that backs them up. And at that point, they're just kind of in, Hail Mary mode, trying to make something happen. They eventually do get the ball down to the KU 23-yard line and had 2 shots at the end zone. But the Kansas defense holds firm and cements, again, one of the biggest wins in KU football program, modern history, really, in the last 15 years or so. One of the biggest regular season wins for KU, as Kansas knocks off previously undefeated Oklahoma, potentially dashes Oklahoma's hopes of making the college football playoff as well. And, of course, the goalposts, they ended up in Potter Lake.
They had to. But no, it was one of those things that I think you're holding your breath until the very, very end. I will say, something that deserves a lot of credit. Well, one thing that kind of stinks, Gabriel completing that long pass to Brendan Thompson, gives Oklahoma at least a chance there. Against Texas Tech, we'll see another situation where a guy kind of gets in a one-on-one situation late and gives up a big play. But second down, Jeremy Robinson, has the pressure and kind of forces Oklahoma into a bad situation on the final play. Austin Booker almost gets home, gets his hands on Gabriel, forces him to step up and maybe throw that ball a little bit sooner. Whereas, if he were able to maybe even kind of get outside the pocket, your defenders are having to defend for a while. And don't forget, Gabriel completed a touchdown pass in a situation like that to beat Texas. And so the pressure on those 2 plays were just huge to kind of seal that thing off. One of the things I thought was fascinating, though, Nick, looking at it after the game, a podcast with former OU greats, Gabe Eichert and Teddy Lehman, they were talking about it after the game. And one of the things that they were kind of yelling about was, they said, how does KU have 2 better running backs than Oklahoma does? And you think about the history of that running back position at Oklahoma. I mean, it's as bright as the running back position, pretty much anywhere. You've got 80 bajillion Heisman winners. It feels like, all of those different things. But, Devin Neal was the number 1 player in the state of Kansas, kind of consensus guy coming out of high school. And was a guy that I think a lot of us who saw him in high school, I know you did as well, felt like he was going to be a really, really good high school player. Daniel Highshaw from Oklahoma, was a guy that was a quarterback in high school, made the transition to running back. But it was one of those where, looking at Oklahoma and Kansas over the course of that game, it wasn't clear that Oklahoma was more physical than Kansas was. It wasn't clear that Oklahoma had better skill position guys than Kansas did. And like you said to start off, the weather probably had a little bit of something to do with that, right? Kansas might have had a little bit. Brennan Thompson is an absolute blazer, and you might have had some trouble chasing that guy down if Oklahoma is able to throw the ball a little bit more. But overall, I don't know that you came out of that game feeling like, oh, this is a fluke. Kansas isn't anywhere near as good as Oklahoma. You felt like it was two pretty evenly matched teams, and Kansas made the plays that they needed to at the end.
So Kansas comes back. They get the win, 38-33, in one of the more chaotic games you will really see, I think. To improve to 6-2, Oklahoma, previously undefeated, goes down just like the goalposts went down in Potter Lake. And Kansas, an incredible win, 6-2. Oklahoma drops to 7-1. And again, at this point, the narrative around Jason Bean has almost completely changed because of this win, right? It's crazy to think that, basically one game, and even with its ups and downs, I mean, this particular game really did fully encapsulate the Jason Bean experience because he played really well, had a couple of huge monumental mistakes, but in the end, he did pull through for the win for Kansas, and again, really changed his perception among KU fans. That was certainly my biggest takeaway from this game for KU. And on top of that, with this win for Kansas, you started to look at the conference standings at the time and think Kansas might have an outside shot at still making a push to, make the Big 12 title game at this point, which is crazy.
You have a win over Oklahoma. Oklahoma still had to play Oklahoma State, and so you felt like potentially Oklahoma could pull one back for you there. And if Texas wound up, say, finishing first, and you could be in that discussion, you still got the game against K-State. If KU won out at that point and Oklahoma would have gone to Stillwater and come out with a win, which they were very close to doing, then you're in the Big 12 title game. You're right there. And also too, don't sleep on. I realized KU had gone to a bowl game the previous year. Don't sleep on getting bowl eligible that early. And being able to say, hey, this is multiple years in a row that you're going to a bowl game. After not going to a bowl game from 2008 on. It's one thing to have 1 year where maybe everything clicks. Maybe, a guy has a hot year. Maybe you have good seniors or whatever else. I think that this win and the fact that Kansas got bowl eligible again at this point, you felt like there was some staying power. I mean, you probably felt that way before, but I think that really kind of sealed it in where you said, okay, it definitely feels that way. And, Kansas winds up very next week traveling to Iowa State. And I really think, when we talk about that, you're going to see the momentum of that fourth down pass really carry over with Jason Bean into that game. And quite frankly, probably through the rest of the season. And so it entirely changed the way that we see Jason Bean, not just in that game, but also the way he played the rest of the season, to where, a lot of us are going to look back. I mean, probably look back now, but a lot of us are going to look back 10 years from now and really feel like Jason Bean was kind of a hero of the season.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think he's definitely being viewed more as a hero now. And part of it was, and certainly a significant chunk of that was this game against Oklahoma. So Kansas moves to 6-2, as you said. Iowa State next up for them, as we'll talk about that next week as we continue our off-season series here of the Jayhawk Rewind on the Pay podcast. Listen, we're 7 weeks away from the start of 2024. We got 6 games left to break down from 2023 to get you fully caught up for the start of 2024. And I could not be more excited. And I know you couldn't either, Kevin, as we're going to be covering KU all throughout this season. So continue to follow us here on the Pay podcast on KCSN, the Kansas City Sports Network, KCSN capital U on YouTube. If you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, leave us a 5-star rating and review as well. And we will talk to you again very soon as well here on the Pay podcast. Until then, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. See ya.